Hello, in this recording, I'm going to spend a little time talking about social perception biases. In previous class work, we talked about cognitive biases, and social perception biases are also cognitive biases because they involve kind of repeated patterns and sometimes errors of cognitive processing. But social perception biases we often think about as how we think about ourselves and others. So they're a little bit more connected to kind of perceptions about people, whereas cognitive biases can, the kind of as a general form can be about information processing that may not be about people, ourselves, or others. So in general, the idea of social perception or bias is that when we think of ourselves and think of others, our thinking may sometimes involve kind of repeated routine shortcuts that are being made, and sometimes erroneous processing. And some of these have been documented to occur in very, expected and repeated ways. So one of the things that we need to think about with social perception biases is accepting that this is just sort of a part of how we tend to process information as humans, not necessarily thinking about this as like a personal flaw of ourselves or others that we have these biases, but just an acceptance of the reality that when faced with more information we can process, when faced with sort of limited details about ourselves and others, our minds simply fill in the blanks and take shortcuts. And just like those other kind of information processing cognitive biases like confirmation bias, when we apply these to ourselves or others at work, they certainly have benefits to helping us make kind of quick judgments, but those judgments can be flawed in systematic ways that may make our decision making problematic or flawed. So one kind of other caveat to take into consideration here is bias is not discrimination. Biases can lead to discrimination, but discrimination is a more active choice making to exclude or include people based on certain characteristics or qualities. So when we talk about bias or saying somebody's biased, certainly people can say things like, I'm biased and I'm going to make this decision, but then that kind of comes into play with more of conscious discrimination. And then the final thing is, biases, some of them can certainly lead to negative outcomes and can contain negative content. And when we think about biases that are particularly negative or purgative to certain groups of people or, certain kind of preferences, we might also label those as prejudice. So it's important to recognize that bias alone doesn't mean that you're consciously acting and you're consciously trying to discriminate, but we just have a lot of this sort of natural cognitive shortcut taking. And especially when we're thinking about social perception or thinking of ourselves and others, it can come into play and create some barriers to high quality processing and information and decision making about others. So if we think about this, why this happens is that decision making is relying on our perceptions. And we saw the Dan Ariely video piece that our brains are sort of, they've sort of grown and evolved to handle the kind of things we need to handle. And so we have high acuity in visual processing, but as Ariely showed, even there, we make visual errors. We can be tricked into, perceiving things differently than they really are with visual perception. But when we also think about kind of these cognitive processings, we have some of the same kinds of challenges. So, we rely on our senses to take in information, and most of that is, seeing and hearing when it comes to processing information about others. And we're not always, well, we certainly never are capable of processing all the information we see, and we naturally engage in selective perception, and we tend to have our attention drawn toward things that are salient, that they stand out. So they stand out as either extremely high performing or extremely low performing, or they stand out as different from ourselves, distinctive from what we're typically used to. So those are the things that draw our attention, and then we kind of selectively perceive. So these are some of the reasons why our social perception can be biased, and it can fool us, and our intuition can fool us. So we want to be mindful of this when we are thinking about giving feedback to other people, thinking about giving performance evaluations, thinking about recruiting and selection and hiring and promotion. All of those kinds of decisions can be harmed by these social perception biases. So just as a, kind of an example here, this is just kind of a stylized view of some research looking at the perceptions of supervisors and subordinates about what was discussed in a meeting. And so if it was a performance evaluation meeting, there were several things that were discussed, including the subordinates' past performance, career development, performance development, and then questions about, do they need the help from the supervisor, mutual goal setting, and then ultimately, in this case, it was a merit-based performance review, what was discussed about salary. And the researchers basically looked at the perceptions the subordinates had and the perceptions the managers had after the meeting. And each one of these, are perceptual gaps. And so, what the manager thought was discussed, they thought that they spent a lot of time talking about career development, talking about past performance. But the subordinate felt like actually career development was one of the lower points here, or far less, and that the need for the supervisor's help, they didn't really perceive hearing much of that at all. So, the takeaway from this is that we give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, and we might think about what we wanted to cover and not necessarily have thought through how this might be heard or received from a feedback standpoint, whether we're being clear and concrete enough about what we want to really be heard in any of the meetings we may have with our employees or our peers or our bosses, for that matter. So these kinds of gaps exist, and they challenge our ability to interact, to accomplish what we want, to kind of communicate what we want with coworkers, and to ultimately accomplish the goals that we have for ourselves and for the organization. So we're going to talk about, in a couple other short videos, a set of these social perception biases. Just like the cognitive biases we talked about, we focused there on confirmation bias, on sunk cost and escalation of commitment, on anchoring, and on framing. There are others, but those are some very common things that trip us up in our decision making and our information processing. Likewise, there are more of these social perception biases than what I have listed here, but these are some that are very common and can interfere with very common activities we might do when we're leading others at work. So I will record one short video with the first three: egocentric bias, positive illusions, and fundamental attribution error. Then I'll do another one talking a little bit about these kind of expectational effects, like the halo effect and Pygmalion. And then finally, one final video talking a little bit more about stereotyping and implicit bias. And that will set us up when we come back to class next week to spend a little bit more time in depth thinking about implicit bias, and then to kind of conclude this topic by thinking about what kind of interventions we can take on to try to reduce the effects of these bias. Because again, just to be very clear, all of us are subject to these kinds of biases. It's not a statement about, who you are, or kind of, your kind of morality or your kind of compass on things. These are just things that are sort of built into the way our brains process information. And so if we understand that our minds will take these shortcuts, And if we understand that there are implications for how we make decisions about people at work from these biases, then we can kind of take that neutral stand and say, okay, if we want the best outcomes for ourselves and our people and our organizations, then we need to think about counteracting these biases and not letting situations occur where these might intervene and might lead to, inequitable, unfair outcomes, sub-optimization of employees and our performance. So that's the frame I'd like to make sure we're thinking about this from, not any kind of blaming frame, more of an acceptance and understanding that these biases exist and they occur. Obviously, we do have situations in organizations where there's overt, active discrimination happening, which is a different problem and takes a certain amount of different interventions than what we're going to talk about at this point in time, which is thinking about how do we structure situations of decision making so that we reduce the impact, the negative impact that these biases can have.